When structural engineers are designing a massive skyscraper, they don't really just calculate how the building supports its own weight on a perfect sunny day.
Right, they have to plan for the worst case scenario.
Exactly, yeah. They obsess over what is called the load path. They ask, what happens when the absolute unthinkable occurs?
Like a natural disaster or something.
Yeah, like what if a primary load-bearing column is just completely obliterated by an earthquake or an explosion?
Right.
In that fraction of a millisecond, millions of pounds of force have to instantly find a new path to the ground. And the surrounding structures, which, were never actually designed to hold that much weight, suddenly take on the entire burden of that catastrophe.
And they buckle under that pressure.
They buckle, they warp, the steel basically screams.
Mm-hmm.
But if the design is resilient enough, the load path redistributes. The building is permanently deformed, it's fundamentally altered, but it does not collapse.
It's the ultimate test of latent structural integrity, really. You are forcing the architecture to endure this state of extreme, agonizing stress that it was just never originally intended to handle.
Right.
And the surviving framework becomes defined entirely by the trauma it is actively holding back.
Exactly. And that is the exact framework we are using today. Because we are looking at this concept not through like steel and concrete, but through the psychology of a society. So, welcome to today's deep dive.
It is great to be here for this one.
Our mission today for you listening is to explore one of the most, I think, compelling case studies in science fiction history. We are looking at the military brotherhood known as the Crimson Fists.
A fascinating group.
Truly. We are looking at a culture that experienced an apocalyptic foundational collapse. We're going to trace their origins, examine their centuries as rootless nomads, and break down the sheer, incomprehensible scale of the tragedy that nearly wiped them from existence.
And of course, analyze the deeply complicated, almost friction-heavy nature of their subsequent resurrection.
Yes, exactly, because it's not a simple rebirth.
No, not at all. It is a phenomenal historical arc to examine. What makes the Crimson Fists so captivating isn't just their martial prowess.
Right, which is pretty much a given in this universe.
Yeah, exactly. It's a given. It's their sociological and psychological evolution that stands out.
Yeah, that's the interesting part.
We are tracking how an organization formed in the bitter aftermath of a galactic civil war manages to sustain its identity, only to have that identity just violently shattered and reforged into a monument of pure, unadulterated trauma response.
Okay, well, let's unpack this because we are diving straight into the deep end of the lore here. And we want to make sure you, our listener, are right here with us, even if you don't know the background.
We'll be your guides through the archives.
Right. We are looking at the foundational DNA of the Crimson Fists. And to understand who they become, you have to understand the ashes they were, born from.
The literal ashes, in many ways.
Yeah, so we are looking at the immediate aftermath of the Horus Heresy, and specifically this event called the Second Founding. And even for those of us deeply familiar with the setting, it is worth pausing to just appreciate the absolute devastation of this era.
Devastation is almost too mild a word for it, honestly. The Horus Heresy ripped the Imperium of Man in half.
Literally in half.
The loyalist Space Marine legions that survived, they didn't emerge triumphant. They emerged hollowed out, bleeding, and surrounded by the wreckage of their creator's dream.
Yeah.
The Imperium was, quite literally, a carcass. And out of that carcass came the Codex Astartes.
Which is such a controversial text.
Oh, absolutely. It was Roboute Guilliman's masterstroke or his greatest tyranny, depending on who you ask in the lore.
Right, the Codex Astartes. Let's look at what this actually represents.
Yeah.
Because it's not just a tactical manual or a helpful book of suggestions.
No, it is a massive draconian compliance mandate.
Forced upon grieving, deeply paranoid demigods. Guilliman looked at these massive legions of tens of thousands of transhuman warriors and realized something terrifying. He realized that if one legion could fall to chaos and nearly burn down the galaxy, the legions themselves were the structural flaw.
Right, they were too big, too powerful.
So he forces them to break apart into chapters of a mere 1,000 warriors each.
And that leads directly to the creation of the Crimson Fists.
Here we go.
They are the sons of Rogel Dorn, the Primarch of the Imperial Fists. And Dorn was the Praetorian. He was the defender of Terra.
The ultimate loyalist, basically.
Exactly. So to him, breaking his legion apart wasn't just a logistical restructure. It was a profound personal insult.
Like a betrayal, almost.
It was a mutilation of his brotherhood.
Yeah.
He resisted the Codex Astartes with everything we had. The tension actually nearly sparked a second civil war right on the heels of the first one.
Wow, yeah. And this is where I want to push back a bit on the traditional narrative of their creation, based on the historical overviews we have.
Sure, what part?
Well, the historical consensus often frames Dorn's eventual acceptance of the Codex Astartes as a, quote, pragmatic decision.
Right, that's the standard framing.
But looking at the psychological reality of that exact moment, I mean, was it really pragmatism or was it just utter crushing defeatism?
That is a very interesting distinction.
Because he didn't compromise out of some enlightened sense of administrative efficiency. He compromised because the alternative was his own brothers wiping out his legion.
I wouldn't necessarily call it defeatism, but I definitely agree it was an incredibly bitter pill to swallow.
Yeah.
He only took it because the alternative was extinction, and that is the absolute core of their genesis. The Crimson Fists were not formed out of glorious conquest.
Right.
They weren't born from a moment of soaring idealism or triumphant pride. They were created from the unyielding legacy of the Imperial Fists being forced to finally yield.
Wow. Forced to yield. That's
Yeah.
powerful.
It was a cold, calculated, level-headed necessity. Rogal Dorn basically took his youngest, most level-headed veterans, the ones most amenable to this new reality, and he spun them off into this new chapter.
Which sets up an absolutely fascinating internal paradox right from day one. I mean, imagine this. You have a brotherhood drawn from a genetic lineage famous for its stubbornness.
Oh yeah, legendary stubbornness.
Their absolute refusal to compromise, this unyielding spirit. And yet, their very existence as the Crimson Fists is predicated entirely on a compromise.
It really is.
It's based on being the guys in the room who basically said, fine, we will follow the new rules.
It absolutely does set up a paradox. When your entire reason for existing is to serve as a living, breathing preventative measure against another civil war, it breeds a very specific type of stoicism.
Right.
Idealism is a luxury of the safe, the prosperous, and the victorious.
That's a great way to put it.
The Crimson Fists, from their very first breath as a distinct organization, are wired to view the universe as a complex set of volatile problems that simply need to be managed, contained, and suppressed.
Yeah.
They are the ultimate pragmatists in a deeply ideological universe.
I think what's fascinating here is how that pragmatism shapes their early culture. If you use an analogy, imagine a massive, monolithic corporation that nearly destroys itself in a vicious internal civil war.
Right, a hostile takeover gone wrong.
Yeah, exactly. So the second founding is this painful, pragmatic corporate restructuring that follows. Accepting the Codex Astartes is like adopting a strict new set of standard operating procedures, just to ensure that kind of civil war never happens again.
Yes, that is exactly what it was.
They are the firefighters, standing in the smoldering ruins of a completely burned-down city, forced to draft a new fire code while their lungs are still just full of smoke.
That is a very evocative image.
It requires you to essentially swallow your pride and admit that the old way, the glorious massive Legion way, failed catastrophically.
Exactly, and the mechanism of that survival is compliance. They adopted the Codex Astartes, and they rigidly adhered to it.
Yeah.
But here is the sociological challenge. How does an organization maintain that incredibly tense, level-headed pragmatism over the span of thousands of years?
That's the million-dollar question.
How do you keep that specific, bureaucratic fire burning in a galaxy that is actively trying to murder you at every turn?
Well, that leads us directly into the massive stretch of time that follows their creation. Because for 9 millennia, the Crimson Fists didn't have a home.
No, they didn't.
They operated as a fleet-based crusade chapter. And we really need to linger on this for a second, because 9,000 years is a timeline that human minds genuinely struggle to even comprehend.
It is an almost incomprehensible span of history. I mean, for context, all of recorded human history on our planet is roughly 5,000 years.
That is insane to think about.
The Crimson Fist spent almost double that amount of time existing entirely out of spaceships. They traveled the Imperium, moving from war zone to war zone, never claiming a single world for their own.
And this is where the logistics and really the cultural reality of a fleet-based chapter just blow my mind.
How so?
Well, if you are a terrestrial culture, your identity is intrinsically anchored to your geography. Your art, your architecture, your diet, your sleep cycles, everything is shaped by the mountains, the oceans, the weather patterns of your home.
Yes, geography dictates culture.
But if you remove geography completely, what becomes the anchor? For 9,000 years, they lived in the cold, humming, artificial environments of strike cruisers and battle barges.
The anchor becomes the mission itself. The operational tempo replaces geography as the defining characteristic of their entire society.
Right.
In the lore, they are often compared to their brother chapter, the Black Templars, who are also a fleet-based crusade force.
Oh, I've heard of them.
But the distinction is crucial here. The Black Templars run on pure, fanatical, religious zeal. They are anchored by their burning hatred and their holy mission.
So they have that religious fire.
Exactly. The Crimson Fists, keeping with their origins, anchored themselves with something entirely different. They anchored themselves to their reputation for loyal service and unwavering competency.
I have to challenge the romance of the word crusade when applied to the Crimson Fist, though.
Go ahead.
Because a crusade implies a burning, passionate, almost irrational fervor.
Yeah.
But if you spend 9,000 years with no permanent anchor, constantly in a state of grinding attrition.
Moving from war zone to war zone.
Yeah, moving from one horrific meat grinder of a planetary war to the next, doesn't unwavering competency just become like a polite euphemism for mechanical, emotionless detachment?
That is a very cynical reading, but I mean, from a psychological standpoint, you aren't wrong.
It just seems so bleak.
Burnout is a well-documented phenomenon. You cannot sustain the acute emotion of zeal for millennia.
Yeah.
It is biologically and psychologically impossible, even for transhumans.
Right. The brain just can't do it.
The zeal has to atrophy, or rather, it has to distill into something chronic and manageable. Unwavering competency is deeply pragmatic. It is the hallmark of a professional who treats apocalyptic warfare not as a holy calling, but as a trade.
It's the difference between an amateur who runs on adrenaline, screaming battle cries, and the veteran who runs purely on muscle memory and spatial awareness.
Exactly.
The Crimson Fists became the Imperium's most reliable contractors. They show up, they review the tactical data, they execute the suppression, they pack up their dead, and they leave.
Very methodical.
Yeah, they lived in their armor on their ships, generation after generation. It's an incredibly isolating, emotionally deadening existence.
It is deadening, but it is also culturally insulating.
How do you mean?
When you live in a closed loop on a starship, surrounded only by your battle brothers and your chapter serfs, your culture is perfectly preserved. The outside universe doesn't contaminate you.
Oh, I see. Like a time capsule.
Exactly. But here is the paradox of that existence. A culture defined entirely by its utility, by its constant motion and its detachment, is ironically very fragile if that motion is ever violently arrested.
Right.
If your entire identity is the nomadic professional, what happens when you finally decide to put down roots?
Well, that brings us to the profound irony that precedes their greatest tragedy. After thousands of years in the void, the Crimson Fists were finally granted a homeworld.
Rin's World.
Rin's World, exactly. They stopped moving. They've built a massive fortress monastery. They began recruiting directly from the local populace. For the first time in their entire history, they had a geographic anchor.
They had civilians to protect.
Yeah, they had a horizon that wasn't a view screen on a strike cruiser.
And from a strategic perspective, acquiring a homeworld is usually a massive boon for a Space Marine chapter.
Because of the resources.
Yes, it provides stable tides, a secure genetic repository, and industrial output. But from a psychological perspective, as you mentioned earlier with the load path analogy, they had just introduced a massive, rigid, stationary pillar into a structure that had survived by being fluid and mobile.
Oh, wow.
They finally had something to lose.
And what they lost it to is one of the most terrifying forces in this universe. So in the year 989 of the 41st millennium, a threat emerges in Loki sector. And we aren't talking about a tactical insurgency or a rebellious planetary governor.
No, this is much worse.
We are talking about an orc warlord named Snagrod. And he carried the title, and this is a phenomenally evocative title, the Arch-Arsonist of Sheridan.
The Arch-Arsonist. It tells you everything you need to know about the nature of the threat.
Yeah, he's not there to negotiate.
No, Snagrod united the disparate warring orc factions into a massive sector-spanning force known as a wage. And we must be clear about what an orc wade actually is.
Please do, because it's wild.
It is not an army in the conventional sense. It is a biological, psychic, and ecological event. It is a cascading tidal wave of violence that alters the very reality around it.
Right, because orcs generate a psychic gestalt field.
Yes, exactly.
The more of them that gather together, the smarter, bigger, and more technologically advanced they become. It is literally a snowball effect of pure entropy.
That's a great way to describe it.
When millions of orcs are united under a warlord like Snagrod, it ceases to be a military campaign and becomes a literal force of nature.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, contrast that force of nature with the Crimson Fists. You have a chapter born from a pragmatic decision, characterized by millennia of unwavering competency, rigid adherence to the Codex Astartes, and level-headed professionalism.
The rule followers.
They are the supreme builders of order, the keepers of the rules, and they are suddenly hit head-on by a foe whose very biological imperative is the mindless, joyous destruction of order.
Wow.
It is the ultimate ideological and physical clash, extreme pragmatism versus pure, unadulterated anarchy.
Which brings us to the actual fall of Ren's world. And I think we need to talk about the specific mechanism of their defeat here, because it wasn't just a matter of being outgunned on the battlefield.
No, it was much more tragic than that.
It was a tragedy compounded by a catastrophic fluke. So they were dug into their fortress monastery, the Arx Tyrannus. They were fully prepared to weather the storm with their legendary defensive capability.
They were doing what Imperial Fist's successors do best, building walls and holding them.
Exactly. And then a rogue plasma missile from their own automated defense batteries malfunctioned, reversed course, and detonated inside their own armory.
The destruction of the Arx Tyrannus is just a devastating detail in the lore. In an instant, the vast majority of the chapter, hundreds of veteran Space Marines, their genetic seed banks, their relics, their chapter master's command staff, all vaporized.
Just gone.
Not by the genius of the Orc warlord, but by a mechanical failure during the worst possible moment.
It is the most brutal irony imaginable. The masters of competency, the level-headed professionals who survived 9,000 years of warfare through strict adherence to procedure, are absolutely gutted by a random, chaotic malfunction in their own house.
It shatters their entire worldview.
And the survivors, who are led by Chapter Master Pedro Cantor, are suddenly thrust into a survival scenario that defies all pragmatic logic.
If we look at the immediate aftermath, this is where the core of their modern identity is truly forged. Cantor and a handful of survivors are cut off, massively outnumbered, and entirely without support.
They're totally alone.
The logical, pragmatic, Codex-approved maneuver would be to attempt a full extraction, abandon the planet, and preserve the genetic legacy of the chapter. The math heavily favored retreat.
But they don't retreat. And this is the paradox that historical accounts of this event always seem to highlight.
Yes.
Ren's world is referred to as their greatest defeat, yet it is simultaneously celebrated as their finest hour.
It's a fascinating contradiction.
And here's where it gets really interesting for me, because I've always struggled with this framing. How can a catastrophic failure of defense, resulting in a 90+% casualty rate in the loss of your fortress, be considered your finest hour?
It requires a fundamental shift in how we and how the Imperium at large evaluate victory.
Okay, unpack that for me.
Well, in standard military doctrine, it is an unmitigated disaster. But in the realm of cultural myth-making and the psychology of a warrior brotherhood, a catastrophic defeat can be far more crystallizing than a routine victory.
Oh, I see.
It acts as a crucible. It burns away the millennia of rote bureaucracy, the rigid reliance on the Codex, and the comforts of their fortress, leaving only the indestructible core of their genetic legacy, that unyielding spirit of Rogel Dorn.
It's basically the Alamo effect, or like Thermopylae.
Exactly, the romanticization of the Last Stand.
But even more extreme, honestly. Because those historical examples were last stands where everyone died to buy time. The Crimson Fist's finest hour wasn't just standing their ground, it was the absolute raw refusal to cease existing.
Yes, the sheer stubbornness of it.
When they are stripped of their ships, their fortress, their serfs, and their grand strategies, what is actually left?
Yeah.
You aren't fighting for the Codex Astartes anymore. You aren't fighting for the Emperor's grand design.
No, you are fighting for the brother bleeding out right next to you.
Exactly, and you are fighting out of pure, localized spite.
Spite and endurance. Their finest hour was not a masterstroke of tactical genius. It was the raw display of their fundamental nature under the most extreme pressure imaginable.
Right back to the load path.
Exactly. The load path was blown out, the structures were collapsing, and Cantor and his men became the sole pillars holding up the legacy of a 9,000-year-old chapter. They carried civilians across orc-infested wastelands. They fought asymmetric guerrilla wars in the ruins of their own cities.
But surviving a pressure test of that magnitude fundamentally alters the material.
Irrevocably.
You don't walk away from the destruction of your entire world without permanent, deep-seated psychological deformation. Which sort of moves us into the aftermath. Like, how did the survivors cope with the fall?
They changed completely.
What does the psychology of the Crimson Fist look like once the dust of Snagrod's Wei-GH finally settles?
The psychological profile shifts violently. Before Rindsworld, they were the calm professionals. After Rindsworld, the chapter's culture becomes defined by extreme stoicism, a grim, suffocating determination, and most crucially, a profound, deep-seated hatred for the orcs.
The hatred becomes central.
Yes. They absorbed the fire of the arch-arsonist, and it calcified into an internal, localized fury.
Let's really dig into that deep-seated hatred, because we often view hatred as a negative, destructive emotion, right? Like a failure of intellect or discipline.
Usually.
But in the context of extreme trauma and transhuman survival, hatred acts as a very specific kind of fuel. When logic and pragmatism are telling you that you are a dying chapter, that you only have a few dozen combat-capable brothers left, and that the universe has effectively erased you, what overrides that math?
Hatred overrides the math.
Yeah.
Pragmatism fails in the face of an apocalypse because pragmatism would dictate surrender or dissolution. You need an irrational, overwhelming emotion to counter an irrational, overwhelming threat.
That makes total sense.
For the Crimson Fists, hatred became their neurochemical anchor. The psycho-indoctrination of a space marine is designed to make them fearless, but it doesn't make them immune to grief.
No, they still feel loss.
When they lost their chapter, that immense grief had to be channeled somewhere, or it would have shattered them completely. They weaponized their own trauma and pointed it directly at the orc species.
I'm going to play devil's advocate here, though.
Sure, go ahead.
Because I look at this shift and I have to ask, is this actually heroic or is it incredibly tragic?
That is the big question.
Is their legendary stoicism a sign of strength, or is it just a massive, unaddressed trauma response masquerading as military discipline?
Right.
If your entire culture is now built around the memory of a shattering tragedy and a blinding, all-consuming hatred for the faction that caused it, are you truly surviving? Or are you just perpetually reacting to your own ghost story, like the worst day of your life on repeat?
That is the grim reality of the 41st millennium.
The Imperium does not offer therapy.
No, definitely not. It demands service. You are absolutely right that it is a trauma response. Stoicism, in this extreme transhuman form, is a psychological tourniquet.
A tourniquet, wow.
It's a wall built around a wound that is simply too catastrophic to heal. They are grim and determined because any other emotional state would require them to genuinely process the unimaginable grief of losing their world and thousands of their brothers.
And they can't do that.
If they stop to feel the grief, the chapter dies. So they feel hatred instead. It is toxic, yes, but it is a highly functional toxicity.
It makes me think of someone who survives a horrific, life-altering accident and spends the rest of their life obsessively, aggressively campaigning against whatever caused the accident.
That's a very grounded way to look at it.
The work they do might be good, their determination is impressive, but their entire existence is permanently tethered to that trauma. The Crimson Fists basically became tethered to Rindsworld. They became a living, breathing monument to their own near destruction. The chapter that refused to die. But survival is supposed to be a state of transition. For them, survival became their permanent address.
And they lived in that state of grim, attritional survival for a long time. They were bleeding out slowly, unable to replenish their numbers fast enough to offset their ongoing campaigns.
It's a slow decline.
They were a dying breed, holding the line purely out of stubbornness, which makes the next phase of their history so incredibly complex and, frankly, culturally jarring.
Which brings us to the Primaris renewal. And this is where the narrative shifts from a slow, stoic death march into a miraculous but sociologically fascinating rescue.
It really flips the script on them.
We transition from the traumatized veterans huddled in the ruins of their fortress monastery, running on the fumes of spite, to the arrival of the Indomitus Crusade.
This raises an important question about identity. Roboute Guilliman, the very Primarch who authored the Codex Astartes that birthed them, returns to the galaxy.
Which is a huge deal on its own.
Massive. He launches the Indomitus Crusade to push back the encroaching darkness, and his fleets arrive at Rindsworld. But he doesn't just bring supplies. He brings the Primaris Space Marines.
The new guys.
A brand new, technologically and biologically upgraded generation of warriors created in secret by the Martian priesthood.
Let's pause and look at the sheer friction of this moment. You have the shattered remnant of the Crimson Fists. These are grizzled, scarred veterans who look into the abyss of the arch-arsonist's fire and refuse to blink.
They've been through hell.
They have forged a bond that can only be created by surviving a 90% casualty rate together. They are defined by their shared trauma.
Right.
And suddenly the sky opens up and an outside force drops in and says, hey, good news, I brought thousands of brand new replacements to bring you back to full strength.
The cultural friction is immense. The Primaris reinforcements are a crucial gift, tactically speaking. They save the chapter from slow extinction, but sociologically, it's a nightmare.
It has to be.
The original survivors, the firstborn, look at these Primaris Marines and see warriors who are bigger, stronger, and armed with the absolute latest technology. But they also see warriors who have absolutely zero lived experience of the chapter's defining tragedy.
I want to use a biological metaphor here to explain this friction, because I think it's much more visceral than just a standard philosophy problem.
I love a good metaphor. Let's hear it.
Imagine a severe burn victim who has lost massive amounts of skin. The doctors take healthy, pristine, lab-grown tissue and graft it onto the traumatized body to save the patient's life.
Okay, I see where you're going.
The new tissue is healthy, it's strong, it does the job, but there is a biological friction. The host body sometimes tries to reject it.
Because it's foreign.
Yeah. The new tissue doesn't have the scars, it hasn't weathered the trauma, and the integration process is incredibly painful and fraught with tension.
That is an incredibly apt metaphor. The Primaris are the grafted tissue. They were gestated in stasis vaults on Mars. They read about the fall of Rin's world in briefing data slates.
They read about it, but they weren't there.
Exactly. They understand the tactical errors and the casualty reports, but they didn't smell the burning promethium. They didn't watch their brothers vaporize in the armory explosion. They didn't drag civilians through the mud while orc warbands hunted them.
Which brings us directly to the ship of Theseus paradox, applied to cultural trauma.
Yes, the classic philosophical thought experiment.
If you have a chapter that is defined down to its very soul by the blood and fire of their greatest defeat, and you suddenly replace 80 or 90% of that chapter with brand new warriors who were never in the fire.
Are they still the Crimson Fists?
Right. Or has Reboot Guilliman effectively erased the unique identity of the chapter and replaced them with generic blue-armored ultramarines who are just painted red and blue?
That is the exact tension running through their ranks right now in the lore. The veteran firstborn might look at the Primaris with deep gratitude for saving their legacy, but also with profound resentment.
It's a complicated mix of emotions.
Very complicated. The new generation hasn't earned the stoicism. They haven't earned the specific, localized hatred of the orcs that defines Cantor's veterans. They are wearing the heraldry of a tragedy they did not suffer.
Imagine being a Primaris Marine deployed to Rin's world.
Right.
You drop into the Fortress Monastery, you have your pristine armor, your advanced bolt rifle, and you look across the arming chamber at a firstborn veteran whose face is just a map of scar tissue.
Right.
He has a bionic arm because an orc tore his real one off and his eyes are just dead to the universe. And you have to say to him, greetings, brother. We share the same legacy.
That veteran is going to look at you and think, you have absolutely no idea what this badge on our shoulder costs.
Exactly. And yet, the operational reality of the chapter demands that they integrate.
They don't have a choice.
The Primaris Marines have to learn to assimilate into the trauma of the survivors. It becomes this enforced cultural assimilation. They're tasked with carrying on a grim struggle that is entirely inherited, not actually experienced.
Yes, the veterans have to teach the recruits how to hate the orcs with the specific venomous intensity that the Crimson Fists require.
It implies that the unyielding spirit of the Crimson Fists is no longer just a biological trait inherited from Rogal Dorn. It has become a taught, almost religious doctrine within their ranks.
It has to be taught now, yes.
The new guys basically have to learn how to act like they survived the apocalypse out of respect for the old guys who actually did. They have to graft the psychological scars onto themselves artificially.
Which brings us to a profound synthesis of everything we've been discussing today. The Crimson Fists are often lauded as the ultimate embodiment of the Imperium's survival instinct.
They really are the poster boys for it.
They were pragmatic in their birth, willing to accept a humiliating restructuring to secure a future. They were steadfast in their nomadic millennia, finding a cold purpose and competency when they lacked a home.
And unyielding in their tragedy.
Yes, utilizing hatred and stoicism as a psychological shield against total annihilation. And now they are forced to be adaptable in their renewal, finding a way to integrate pristine new life into a culture that is entirely defined by death.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener?
Yeah.
I think they took the worst thing that could possibly happen to them, the absolute destruction of their home, their brothers, and their pride, and they used it as the foundation to rebuild.
It's an incredible story of endurance.
They didn't just survive the pressure of the falling building. They became the load-bearing pillars. It's a testament to the idea that even in the darkest, most oppressive scenarios imaginable, facing the ultimate test of endurance can forge a spirit that simply cannot be broken.
It will be deformed, it will be deeply scarred, but it will not break.
Right.
They're a brutal reminder that resilience isn't always pretty. It isn't always hopeful or bright. Sometimes resilience is grim, it is stoic, and it is fueled by a terrifying desire for retribution.
Yeah. Survival can be ugly.
But it is still a force that propels them forward, ensuring that the legacy of Rindsworld is a story of survival rather than just an epitaph.
But I want to leave you with a final, lingering thought to mull over long after this deep dive is finished. We started by talking about the structural load path, how a building handles the sudden pressure of an explosion.
The defining trauma?
The Crimson Fists are defined by that explosion. Their legends, their internal culture, their very interactions with the new Primaris Marines are all dictated by the fact that they survived the absolute brink of destruction.
Everything they are is tied to that moment.
But if your entire identity, your absolute core, is forged in the blood and fire of your greatest defeat, if you only know who you are because of the trauma that tried to destroy you, what happens if you ever actually win?
What happens when the orcs are finally purged from the sector, and the fortress monastery is fully rebuilt, and the fire is definitively put out?
Exactly. Does surviving the ultimate horror mean that your culture permanently loses the ability to exist in peace? If you were defined entirely by the pressure holding you together, you might just fall apart the moment that pressure is finally released.
It is a chilling thought to leave on.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We've loved exploring the complex, tragic history of the Crimson Fists with you, and we'll be waiting right here for our next exploration. Until then, keep digging into the lore and stay curious.